Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So it's been a little while since I made a video updating the Russia-Ukraine conflict, so I figured I would take this opportunity because although we haven't seen any changes on the battlefield, the lines of contention have remained about the same. We have seen some diplomatic updates that have made front page news, so I figured I would cover them. So over the past week, the Russia-Ukraine conflict has been defined by really a brief ceasefire attempt, but continued fighting along the front line, renewed Russian drone attacks, and signs that both sides are preparing for a longer war rather than a quick settlement. So the biggest development over the past week was the short May 9th to May 11th ceasefire, which was connected to Russia's Victory Day celebrations in Moscow. So maybe you saw the celebrations. The normal boisterous parade was different this year. There were not military tanks and vehicles and new weapons systems rolling through the Kremlin, rolling through Moscow. Instead, a much more subdued Victory Day celebration. Oftentimes, Putin brings in many leaders from around the world. Much smaller celebration this year. And again, the military hardware that the Putin administration loves to show off every year was absent this year. So that made a lot of international news front pages about, okay, the war is going a certain direction, it seems, for the Russians. They can't even have their conventional celebration. So setting that aside, the ceasefire itself from May 9th to the 11th on paper was supposed to create a temporary pause in the fighting and even possibly open space for further diplomacy, maybe leading to an end to the conflict. However, in practice, the ceasefire was pretty limited and pretty unstable. Reuters reported that both Russian and Ukraine accused each other of violating the ceasefire. Ukrainian officials even came out and said that there were more than 200 battlefield clashes that took place over this period. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia avoided large-scale missile and drone attacks during part of the ceasefire, but did continue assaults along sections of the front where Russian forces have been trying to advance. So an attempt at a ceasefire, but we saw several ceasefire violations. So this does matter because it shows that the difference between a symbolic pause and a real ceasefire. The war, even during this temporary cessation of hostilities, did not stop. It certainly slowed in some areas, but it continued in others. From Ukraine's perspective, the ceasefire showed that Russia was not seriously changing its military behavior. From Russia's perspective, Moscow continued to frame itself as open to negotiations while still pressing military advantages on the battlefield. Excuse me, sorry. And once the ceasefire ended, the war quickly returned to a more familiar pattern. Russian drone strikes against Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. In fact, Reuters reported that Russian forces launched more than 200 drones overnight after the ceasefire ended. Ukrainian officials said they intercepted or neutralized most of those drones, but the attacks still cause damage to energy infrastructure and residential buildings. We've seen these attacks on energy infrastructure year after year from the Russians attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure sites. And as soon as the ceasefire was over, this continued. So this does matter because Russia continues to use drones not only as battlefield weapons, but also as tools to pressure Ukrainian leadership to maybe change their thought process for finding a solution to the conflict. Ukraine itself also appears to be increasing its own long-range strike campaigns and capabilities. A different Reuters article reported that Zelensky said that Ukrainian forces had struck gas facilities deep inside, more than 1,500 kilometers inside Russia. So you may have seen some of these photos of energy sites burning, energy infrastructure being attacked. And this is significant because it shows Ukraine's growing ability to hit targets deep inside Russian territory. These strikes are not likely to end the war by themselves, but they raise the cost of war for Russia and show that Ukraine is trying to pressure Russian logistics, energy infrastructure, and the broader war economy. So if Russia is continuing to use drone attacks as a way to put pressure on Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian authorities are using these strikes deep inside Russia to put Russian authorities under pressure from citizens. And we've seen a lot of reporting, maybe I'll make a separate video on it, a lot of reporting about how Putin has changed his behavior, and he's in hiding now, and he doesn't want to be seen in public as much because he's worried about these long distance attacks from the Ukrainians. So from the Ukrainian perspective, their attacks are changing the battlefield and the political dynamics inside the Russian Federation. So on the battlefield itself, we know that the war remains concentrated around eastern Ukraine, especially Donetsk. Reuters reported that Russian forces are still pressing to seize the remaining parts of the Donetsk region, which Russia considers their territory now, but Moscow has demanded Ukrainian give up this territory. Of course, we can imagine that the Ukrainians have refused to accept that demand, and this is one of the reasons peace talks remain so stuck. The central territorial question has not changed. Russia wants Ukraine to concede land, and Ukraine wants Russian forces to withdraw. So we see that the two sides, even when they say, okay, we'll have a temporary ceasefire, the underlying issues of the conflict remain the same about territory. The Institute for the Study of War reported that Russian and Ukrainian forces continued limited offensive operations even on the final day of the ceasefire. ISW, which if you don't follow, is a great publication for knowing what's going on with the conflict. They put out fantastic maps showing the front lines of the battlefield. So ISW also noted that Russian forces recently advanced in the Pokrovsk direction, while Ukrainian drones near occupied Mariupol have been targeting Russian ground lines of communication in the occupied Donetsk and towards Crimea. So this does matter. That might seem like it's just something that's occurring, but this does matter because the war is not only about holding trenches at the front, but it is also about logistics, whether Russia can move troops, fuel, ammunition, and equipment through occupied territory. and whether Ukraine can disrupt these movements with drones and long-range strikes. Bill Kristol gave an interview over the weekend where he spent the whole 45-minute interview talking about how drones and drones were playing out in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, in the sheer quantity of drones in the battle space, millions and millions and millions of drones. I think it's hard to even comprehend from a U.S. perspective what that looks like on the battlefield. So we see that the main takeaways over the past week have been temporary ceasefire, which did not hold. Even during the ceasefire, there were still attacks, maybe limited, maybe not as extreme as outside that window. But as soon as the ceasefire ended, the fighting resumed. But also importantly, and I think worth noting, is the May Day celebration, the Victory Day celebration, was much more limited in years past. And this did garner a lot of attention because people see how depleted maybe the Russian military is. So we'll see. We know that the U.S.-Iran conflict has really taken much of the media's attention, but over the past few days we did see these few articles really making the front page of Western newspapers as the Russia-Ukraine conflict continues. Thank you.